The morning I learned my blueprint was about to win a $300 million federal contract, I was sitting at my kitchen table in a pair of jeans I had owned for 9 years, drinking coffee out of a chipped mug my daughter had painted in the third grade, and trying to remember whether I had paid the electric bill on time. 8 months earlier, the same blueprint had been called worthless, in a conference room, in front of 4 of my colleagues, by the CEO of the firm where I had worked for 9 years, and where I had assumed, in the casual way 52-year-old men assume things, I would probably finish my career. Her name was Diane Mercer. She wore a charcoal blazer that day. She set the blueprint on the table between us with a specific deliberateness, and she said the word worthless the way you say a word you have rehearsed. I want to tell you that I walked out of that conference room with dignity. I did not. I walked out of it with my hands shaking and a daughter's dentist appointment to make by 4 o'clock and a savings account that would carry us for maybe 7 months if I was careful. I rolled the blueprint up. I put it in a cardboard tube on the top shelf of the hall closet, behind the box of Christmas ornaments my late wife had labeled in her handwriting in 2009. And I went to bed that night believing the way men of a certain age sometimes believe at midnight, that maybe she had been right. She was not right. But knowing something and being able to prove it to a room full of people who have already decided otherwise are two very different things. And what happened in the 8 months between her sentence and the federal panel's announcement is the story I want to tell you. Because it is not the story I would have written for myself when I was 25, or 35, or even 45. It is something quieter than that. It is the story of how a 52-year-old engineer with a 12-year-old daughter and a paid-off truck and 28 years of work nobody had bothered to look at closely learned, finally, what his own work was actually worth. Her name was Diane Mercer, as I said. She was 43. She had inherited the firm 6 years earlier from her late partner's family, a man named Halverson, who had spent 31 years building it from a 2-person practice in a strip mall to a credentialed regional name that did federal infrastructure consulting from Pittsburgh to Baltimore. I had worked under Halverson for 2 years before he died. I had liked him. He was the kind of senior partner who would walk down to a junior engineer's cubicle at 7 into the evening and ask, not with condescension, but with genuine curiosity, what you were working on. Diane was different. Not bad. Different. She had an MBA, 2 consulting credentials from firms whose names appeared on the side of conference centers, and a conviction that the engineering industry was failing to modernize at the pace the market required. She brought in 2 consulting firms in her second year. She restructured the technical review process in her third. By her 5th year, the firm was billing more than it ever had under Halverson, and the senior engineers who had been with the firm for 20 years had mostly stopped speaking up in meetings. The Briar Creek Bridge replacement consultation came across my desk on a Wednesday morning in early August. A federal infrastructure project. Preliminary scope of approximately $300 million over an 8-year build cycle. A bridge that carried 82,000 vehicles a day across a river that had flooded twice in the previous decade. The kind of project that justified the existence of a firm like ours. I spent 6 weeks on the methodology. I drew on every project I had worked on in 28 years. I anchored the analysis on a microfracture propagation method I had developed during the I-79 retrofit in 2008, a method that had been refined across 3 federal projects and that, to my knowledge, no other firm in our region was currently using at the level we could use it. I was not arrogant about it. I was just clear-eyed. I knew what the methodology was. I knew what it could see that other methodologies missed. I presented it to Diane on a Tuesday afternoon. There were 4 other people in the conference room, 2 senior engineers I had worked with for 9 years, her chief of staff, a junior associate who was barely 6 months out of his master's program. I walked through the methodology for 45 minutes. I answered questions. I felt at the end of the presentation that it had gone reasonably well. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the binder on her side of the table. Inside the binder was a recommendation memo from one of the consulting firms she had brought in. She read from it for about 30 seconds, summarizing what it said. Then she looked at me. "Frank," she said, "I appreciate the work you've put into this. I do. But this blueprint is worthless. It's based on assumptions that haven't been industry standard since the early 2000s. We can't take this to the federal panel." I said, "Diane, this methodology has been used on 3 federal projects I personally worked on. It's not outdated. It's just not what the consultants you brought in last quarter are recommending." She smiled the way people smile when they have already made the decision and are extending the conversation as a courtesy. She said, "Frank, I know you've been here a long time. I respect that. But the world has moved on. We need to move with it." She let it sit for a moment. Then she said, "I think we're going to need to part ways." There was a silence in the conference room that I had not heard before in 9 years of working in that building. The junior associate was looking at his laptop with the intensity of a man trying to project himself out of the room entirely. The 2 senior engineers were looking at the table. Diane was looking at me with an expression that was not unkind. It was simply settled. The decision had been made before I had walked in. I sat there for about 4 seconds. I tried to remember what I had told my daughter Hannah that morning about the dentist appointment, whether I had said 3:45 or 4 o'clock, whether her library book was in her backpack. My brain was doing what brains do when they are presented with information they cannot yet process. It was looking for somewhere else to go. Eventually I said, "I understand." I picked up the blueprint. I rolled it carefully, the way you roll a document you intend to use again. I walked out of the conference room. I took the elevator to the parking garage. I sat in my truck for 11 minutes before I could trust myself to drive. I picked up Hannah at 3:45. I took her to the dentist. She told me about a girl in her math class who had brought a snake to school in her backpack. I laughed in the right places. That night, after she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and read the blueprint from the first page to the last. I had been a structural engineer for 28 years. The blueprint was not worthless. I knew this the way I knew my own name, but knowing it was not the same as being able to do anything about it. I rolled it back up. I put it on the top shelf of the hall closet. I went to bed. I lay in the dark for a long time. The first week was the hardest, and not for the reasons you would think. The money was tight, but not catastrophic. The harder thing was the time. For 30 years, my day had started at 5:45 with a cup of coffee and a project file. Now there was no project file. There was only the kitchen table and the slow morning light. Hannah figured it out on Thursday. She came into the kitchen, watched me stir my coffee for longer than coffee requires stirring, and said, "Dad, did something happen at work?" I told her the version a 12-year-old can carry. I lost my job. They decided to go in a different direction. She thought about it. Then she said, Was it because you did something wrong? I said no. I disagreed with the boss about how to do something, and she got to be right because she was the boss, even when she wasn't. She nodded slowly. She said, "Are we going to be okay?" I said, "Yeah. It might take some time, but we're going to be okay." She finished her cereal. She put her bowl in the sink. She walked toward the front door. Then she came back. She stood in the kitchen doorway and she said, "Dad, you know things. Other people don't always know that you know them, but you know them." Then she went to school. I sat at the table for a long time after the front door closed. 12-year-olds say things sometimes that adults need to hear, and they do not understand they are saying them. She said it because she meant it, because she had grown up watching me work, and she had absorbed something about the work that she could not have articulated. I got up. I made another cup of coffee. I went down to the small office I had set up in the basement years ago, back when our previous firm had encouraged consulting work on the side. I sat down at the desk. I opened a fresh notebook. I wrote, at the top of the first page, Briar Creek, Independent Review. I did not know yet what I was going to do with it. I just knew I was not going to put the blueprint back in the closet and let it become an old hurt I revisited at Christmas. I was going to work. The first 3 weeks, I did what an engineer does when he has no client and no employer and no instructions. I built my own brief. I pulled every public document I could find on the Briar Creek consultation, the federal agency's preliminary scope of work, its environmental review, the list of approved bidders. Halverson Mercer was on the list. So were 8 other firms. I read all of it. I made notes in the margins. I built a parallel methodology document that addressed every concern I had identified during my time on the project, plus the additional concerns I could see in the public scope that the consultants Diane had hired would almost certainly miss. By the end of the 3rd week, I had a 140-page independent technical review. It had no client. It had no commission. It was, by every objective measure, an exercise in stubbornness. But it was also, I knew, correct. I called Ray Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon. Ray had been my mentor's protege 30 years earlier when I was a junior engineer at a firm in Pittsburgh that no longer existed. He was 68 now, semi-retired, on the advisory board of 2 federal agencies and 3 engineering schools. He had been the chief engineer onto the I-79 retrofit in 2008. He knew me. He knew my work. He picked up on the 3rd ring. I told him what had happened. I told him about the blueprint, about Diane Mercer, about the review I had been building. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Frank, send me the review." I said, "Ray, I'm not asking you to do anything. I just wanted you to know what was happening." He said, "Frank, send me the review." I sent it that night. He called me back 4 days later. It was a Sunday afternoon. Hannah was at a friend's house. I was repainting the trim on the porch railing because I needed something to do with my hands. He said, "Frank, where are you on the bid timeline?" I said, "I'm not on the bid timeline, Ray. I'm not bidding. I don't have a firm anymore." He said, "Yes, you do. You have you. And you have a review that addresses 3 structural concerns the agency has been quietly worried about for 2 years and that none of the bidders have so much as acknowledged. So I'm going to ask you again, where are you on the bid timeline?" I sat down on the top step of the porch. The paintbrush was still in my hand. I looked at it for a moment. I said, "Ray, I'd need to register an entity. I'd need insurance. I'd need a team. I'm not in a position to do that in the timeline that's left. He said, Frank, I've already talked to 2 people. They want to be on this with you. They want to be on it because you wrote that review. Not because of who I am, because of who you are. Now stop telling me what you can't do and start telling me what you need. I held the phone for a moment. I said, Ray, why are you doing this? He said, because in 2008, when I was the chief on the I-79 retrofit, you came to my office at 10 at night to tell me that my preferred grouting solution was going to fail in 20 years. You were 28 years old. I had 30 years on you. I told you to go home. You stood there in my office and you told me again with the calculation worked out on a yellow legal pad. And I went home that night and I sat at my kitchen table and I redid your math. And you were right, I changed the spec the next morning. That bridge is still standing because you would not go home. So I am not doing this for you, Frank. I am doing this because I owe a debt, and it is past time I paid it. I did not say anything for a moment. He said, I'll call you tomorrow morning at 8. He hung up. I sat on the porch step with the paintbrush in my hand for a long time after that. The next 8 weeks were the busiest of my professional life. We registered the entity the following Tuesday. Caldwell Hayes Structural Review, LLC Ray as senior advisor, me as principal engineer. The 2 people Ray had called were Marta Reyes, 46, a materials specialist who had spent 15 years at a federal lab before moving into private practice, and Daniel Okafor, 38, a structural analyst who had been one of my mentees at the firm I had left 9 years before Halverson Mercer. Marta brought the materials science depth my review had referenced, but not fully owned. Daniel brought the modern computational tools that let us run the fatigue projections against current load assumptions in ways I would have needed 3 more weeks to do by hand. We were small, we had no office, we met at my kitchen table on weekdays and at Marta's apartment on weekends. Hannah grew used to seeing 3 adults hunched over rolled blueprints while she did her homework in the next room. She asked me one night, after Marta and Daniel had gone home, what we were working on. I told her about the bridge, about the federal contract, about the methodology the firm had said was worthless and that I now believed could win the bid. She said, Dad, is this the same blueprint? I said, yes. We've added to it, but the core is the same. She thought about that. Then she said, so they were wrong. I said, I think they were wrong. We'll see what the agency thinks. She said, when do they decide? I said, 8 months from when she told me it was worthless. We have about 5.5 months left. She nodded slowly. She went back to her math homework. About 10 minutes later, she came back to the kitchen and said, Dad, I'm going to start a notebook about this so we remember. I said, remember what? She said, everything. So when it's over, we know what happened. She did. She started a notebook that week. She kept it in her room. I never asked to read it. She would tell me sometimes at dinner what she had written. Small things. Marta laughed at one of Dad's jokes. Daniel brought donuts. Dad got off the phone with Ray and looked happy for the first time in a long time. Dad worked until 11 again. She was 12 years old and she was building a record. We submitted the bid on a Friday morning in early March, 417 pages. Our retrofit methodology, our materials analysis, our load projections, our risk assessment. A 30-page section on microfracture propagation in aging steel. that drew directly on the methodology Diane Mercer had called outdated. The agency's review window was 60 days, then a presentation phase, then a final award. We made it to round 2 on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at the grocery store with Hannah when Ray called. I stood in the cereal aisle and listened to him tell me we had moved forward. Hannah watched my face. When I got off the phone, she said, "We made it?" I said, "We made it to the next round." She said, "Are you smiling, Dad? I haven't seen you smile like that in a while." I said, "I might be. I'm trying not to get ahead of myself." She said, "Get ahead of yourself for a minute. It's okay." We bought ice cream that night, which we never did on a weeknight. Round 2 was the second week of May. There were 4 firms in the room. One of them was Halverson Mercer. I had not seen Diane Mercer in 7 months. She walked into the conference room at the federal agency's regional headquarters at 9:15, in a navy blazer with 3 senior engineers and her chief of staff. She saw me sitting at the table for the small bidders with Marta and Daniel and Ray. Her expression did not change much. There was a moment of recognition, then a small adjustment. Then she nodded politely, the way you nod at someone you know professionally but did not expect to see in this particular room. Ray leaned over to me and said very quietly, "Eyes forward, Frank. The work is the work." The presentations took 6 hours. Halverson Mercer presented first. Their methodology was sophisticated and credentialed and built on a framework the consultants Diane had hired had assured her was the industry direction. It also, I noticed, did not address 2 of the 3 structural concerns my review had identified. The third it addressed only in a footnote. We presented third. I spoke for the first 35 minutes. Marta covered the materials science section. Daniel ran the load projection demonstration. Ray spoke for the last 10 minutes as senior advisor, and what he said in those 10 minutes was not about our methodology. It was about why the methodology mattered, about the 82,000 vehicles a day that crossed the Briar Creek Bridge, about what happens to microfractures in steel that has been carrying load for 47 years, about what the agency owed the people who drove across that bridge every morning on their way to work. When he finished, there was a quiet in the room that I had not heard in many conference rooms in my career. The lead reviewer, a senior agency engineer named Patricia Vance, thanked us. She thanked the other firms. She said the agency would make its round 2 decision within 10 business days. We walked out into the hallway. Diane Mercer was waiting for the elevator. There was a moment when we were standing 4 feet apart and could not pretend we did not see each other. She said, "Frank?" I said, "Diane?" She said, "I didn't know you'd started your own firm." I said, "I didn't either. 8 months ago." She looked at me for a moment. She did not say anything else. The elevator arrived. She got on it. The doors closed. Ray put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Whatever happens now, Frank, you walked into that room today as the engineer you've always been. The room saw it. That's already done." We made it to round 3 12 days later. The presentation was 8 days after that. Shorter, sharper questions. Patricia Vance asked me directly in front of the panel and the 2 competing firms how I had developed the microfracture propagation methodology that anchored our analysis. I told her. About the I-79 retrofit in 2008. About Ray Caldwell's office at 10 at night. About the yellow legal pad. I told her the methodology had been refined across 3 federal projects and a decade of independent practice. I told her it had been called outdated more than once by people who had not used it. She nodded. She made a note. She did not ask another question. The award was announced 11 days later. Ray called me at 8:45 in the morning. Hannah was at the kitchen table eating her oatmeal. I had not been able to eat anything. He said, "Frank, the agency selected our bid." I sat down on the chair next to Hannah. I said, "Say it again, Ray." He said, "We won. $304 million over 8 years. We won, Frank." I do not remember what I said next. I remember Hannah looking at me. I remember setting the phone down on the table. I remember her getting up and coming around to my side of the table and hugging me. The kind of hug a 12-year-old gives when she does not have words for what she is feeling and decides the hug will have to do the work. She said into my shoulder, "I knew, Dad." I said, "Knew what, sweetheart?" She said, "I knew." The formal award announcement was the following Thursday in the auditorium at the federal agency's regional headquarters. Small press contingent. Representatives from the other bidders. Senior agency officials. 2 members of the Federal Infrastructure Oversight Board. Diane Mercer was there. Her senior staff was there. Patricia Vance gave the announcement. She read the formal language. She named Caldwell Hayes Structural Review as the awarded firm. She read the contract value. Then she said something that was not in the prepared remarks. She said the agency would like to specifically acknowledge the methodology that anchored the awarded bid. The microfracture propagation analysis used in the Caldwell-Hayes submission is being formally adopted as a recommended assessment standard for all bridge retrofit projects under this agency's review. The methodology was developed by Frank Hayes, principal engineer at Caldwell-Hayes, over a career spanning 28 years. The agency commends Mr. Hayes for the rigor and longevity of his work and notes that it is being adopted in part to ensure that this level of analysis becomes the floor, not the ceiling, for projects of this importance. There was a polite round of applause, the kind you hear at federal announcements, restrained, procedural. I did not look at Diane Mercer. I did not need to. What I looked at was Hannah, sitting in the third row with her notebook open on her lap, writing. She looked up when she felt me looking. She smiled. She mouthed 2 words. I knew. I do not know exactly what she had written in that notebook over the 8 months. I have not asked to read it. She has it still on the shelf in her room, beside the books her mother used to read her. I drove her home that afternoon. We did not talk much in the car. She watched the road. I watched her sometimes in the rear view. When we got home, I went into the hall closet. I took down the cardboard tube from behind the Christmas ornaments. I unrolled the blueprint on the kitchen table. I looked at it for a long time. Hannah came into the kitchen with a glass of water. She stood beside me. She looked at the blueprint. The same one she had seen me carry home 8 months earlier on a Tuesday afternoon when her father had been told his work was worthless. She said, "Dad, are you going to frame it?" I said, "I don't think so, sweetheart. I think I'm going to keep using it." She nodded. She seemed to find this satisfactory. She said, "Can I write that down?" I said, "Yes, you can write that down." She did. I am 53 years old now. The Briar Creek project is in its 2nd year of pre-construction analysis. Caldwell Hayes has grown to 7 employees. Marta is a full partner. Daniel's leading our analysis division. Ray comes in 3 days a week, mostly to drink coffee and tell stories, and occasionally to redirect a junior engineer who is about to make a mistake he himself made in 1981. I have not spoken to Diane Mercer since the morning in the hallway. I do not think about her very often. I used to, For a while, in the early months after she told me my blueprint was worthless, I thought about her every day. I rehearsed conversations in my head. I imagined what I would say if I ever got the chance. I never said any of it. The chance came and went, and when it did, I was already past needing to say it. This is the thing nobody tells you about recognition. When it finally arrives, it does not feel like victory. It feels like a long, quiet exhale. It feels like the closing of a question that had been open for a long time. The question was not whether you were good at what you did. You had always known that. The question was whether anyone else would ever see it. When the answer finally comes, you do not need the person who could not see it to suddenly see it. You only need the people who could. My daughter saw it. My mentor saw it. The federal agency saw it. The 2 engineers who chose to work with me on a kitchen table for 8 months saw it. That was enough. It was always going to be enough. The blueprint sits in the cardboard tube on the top shelf of the hall closet. I take it down once or twice a year when I want to remember. I unroll it on the kitchen table. I look at it. I roll it back up. It is the same blueprint it was 8 months before the contract. It is the same blueprint it was the morning Diane Mercer told me it was worthless. It is the same blueprint it was the night I lay in bed and waited for morning. The blueprint did not change. The world simply caught up to it. That is the part I want my daughter to remember. Not the moment in the auditorium. Not the contract value. Not the announcement. The part I want her to remember is this. You do the work. You do it correctly. You do it for long enough that you know in your bones it is correct. And then you wait. Not bitterly. Not with rehearsed grievance. You wait the way a person waits for the morning, because you have done this enough times to know that the morning comes. It came for me at 52 years old, in an auditorium in Philadelphia, with my 12-year-old daughter in the 3rd row writing in a notebook. It was worth waiting for. It is, I think, always worth waiting for.